glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today about emotionally intelligent engineering. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, emotional intelligence is the ability to understand and manage your own emotions and recognize and positively influence the emotions of those around you. And I wanted to talk about it because I didn't always think of it as important for software engineering. I thought being a good engineer meant being a good coder and having a lot of technical skills like refactoring and testing and other best practices and understanding technical concepts like discrete math and race conditions. And those skills are super important, but as I'll explain, they're not really the whole picture. What's more, I often found that I was using these different dimensions to measure code and determine whether it was good or bad solely on these technical scales. And this, to me, led to a very judgmental and binary mindset. And often disagreements were about whether I was right about whether the code was good or bad or somebody else was wrong. For example, like it's wrong to use tabs instead of spaces, or it's wrong to write monolithic applications instead of microservices. But I think in hindsight, this attitude led to a lot of less than constructive conversations. And burnout. Even though I was coming from a place of wanting to improve the code that I was working on, I mostly just made myself and others feel bad. A lot of this is attributed to me struggling with inner critic, and this emphasis on right and wrong and good and bad often led to me downing myself and getting in debates with myself as much as I disagree with other people, because I was really defensive and got into a lot of heated arguments. And this same self-doubt also led to me struggling with imposter syndrome. And sometimes I still wonder why Eighth Light allows me to give these talks. But when I look around, I also noticed there were other people suffering from burnout and what I now recognize or attribute to a lack of emotional intelligence. For example, there was a story a few years ago about Guido van Rossum, who was formerly the benevolent dictator for life of Python, the programming language. And as the title implies, he seemed like he was a really nice guy, but I think he got burned out and had to take a really long break after a really heated and toxic discussion where he basically was not attacked, but got into really heated debates in the Python programming language forums about how to improve the language. And after that, kind of toxic interaction, he decided to take a break. And I've seen lots of examples of this play out elsewhere, and it resonates with my experience. And so I've decided to give this talk as a way to raise awareness within tech about emotional intelligence and to emphasize the importance of these skills and to provide some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. Because after learning about this and practicing it and trying to actively develop it for the last few years, I've noticed a huge improvement in not just how I feel and how I respond to my feelings, but also my relationships with others. And it's not a cure-all. I still struggle with imposter syndrome, but I've gotten better at coping with it. And I still get into arguments with people, but I've gotten better at approaching those arguments as an opportunity to learn rather than trying to win the argument and prove that my way is the right way. And so emotional intelligence helps with a lot of these kinds of struggles because it is bolstered by a lot of these core competencies that break it down into being able to get to know yourself better through self-awareness, to respond, not react with self-management, to find out what really motivates you and what's your drive, and learning to use that understanding to understand others through social awareness and manage those relationships better. And a critical point I want to emphasize is that these skills are on par in terms of importance with technical skills. We spend a lot of time reading books and doing code katas to learn more skills and knowledge in the technical domain, but I think it's just as valuable to spend time working on developing skills and knowledge of these competencies as well. And since this is a talk for engineers, I'm going to take some time to explain each in detail, and I've got an engineering analogy for each one, so I hope you'll hear me. And I'll start with self-awareness, which if you think about self-awareness for a software application, you can think of it like monitoring and alerting. Is your code well instrumented so that you can see whether or not it's healthy? Or did you not realize your site was down until a customer tweeted at you? And for people, this involves being aware of our thoughts and feelings. Since we can't write code to measure our own anxiety or anger levels, you have to learn to become aware of thoughts and feelings as they arise. And this can be a little overwhelming at times. And sometimes it's almost like being blown around in a tornado, which is a relatively recent experience for those of us who are based in Chicago. We had one on Monday, or a dozen really. I've also found that, my thoughts can often be very repetitive and sometimes annoying. And Buddhists have a term for this called the monkey mind. But there's another mind that I've had to learn to deal with, which predates the monkey mind, and that's the reptilian brain, or the parts of our brain that aren't connected to the verbal centers, such as the basal ganglia, which is responsible for involuntary actions like breathing and swallowing, and also the amygdala, which is something you've probably heard of before. It's responsible for the fight, flight, and freeze response. And even though these parts of our brain can't speak to us, like the monkey mind, our inner thoughts, they are still able to send us signals through other phenomena you're probably familiar with, like sweaty palms and butterflies in our stomach. And it's really important that we have these kinds of impulses because they were really useful way back in the day when we had to avoid predators like this jaguar in the forest. But they're a bit overkill when it comes to responding to push notifications and emails. And so part of self-awareness is learning how to become aware of these thoughts and feelings and learning how to, as I'll get to later, respond to them skillfully. But it can definitely feel a little overwhelming. Sometimes I found myself getting stuck in negative thought spirals or weighed down by heavy feelings. But I've got a couple tips I want to share that have helped me learn to raise my self-awareness in a way that's not overwhelming. And the first one is that I try to notice thoughts and feelings as they first arise, so as early as possible, and also when they fade away. So if we look at this GIF of the wave, when does the wave really start? Do you see it starting as it swells in the background, or did you not notice until it's crashing? And also take a second to notice when it's receding back into the ocean. And this is really important, and I'll get to self-management more later, but it's way easier to deal with anger if you think of it as a wave and trying to quell that wave when it's just simmering or when it's swelling in the background as opposed to when it's already crashing over you. Another thing I found really helpful is trying to not identify with my thoughts and feelings as much. For example, instead of telling myself or recognizing to myself that I'm nervous, I try to instead frame it as an experience of quickness of breath and tingling. And my favorite analogy that brings a lot of clarity to this idea is the concept of a mirror, which isn't changed by what it reflects. Just because you're observing a thought or emotion doesn't mean you are that thought or emotion. You're your thoughts and your emotions to about the same extent as the cloud gate, or as we sometimes call it, the bean, is the Chicago skyline. It's still the bean, it's just reflecting the Chicago skyline the same way that you're still you, whether you're experiencing nervousness or anxiety or anger. And so to bring this back to software engineering, I wanted to try a little exercise for practicing self-awareness. And to do that, I'm going to show you a series of prompts. And for each one, try not to get too embroiled in a recent experience you might have had, and try to instead sit back and notice the thoughts and emotions that might be arising when you see the prompt. Think about each prompt as a pebble that we're going to be dropping into a pond, and your job is to watch the ripples. Starting with PR changes requested. Documentation. Crash. Promotion. interview, PR approved, performance review, demo. Okay, and that's it for the prompts. I want to take a second to see if anyone noticed anything, any thoughts or any feelings that they want to share about any of the particular prompts. That's all right. Feel free to speak up if you change your mind. So I tried to include a mix of prompts which have positive, neutral, and negative connotations. And maybe some of the thoughts and emotions that occurred to you were surprising. Maybe you were also distracted occasionally thinking about your next meeting, and that's totally fine. Self-awareness includes noticing when we're distracted as much as it notices when we're angry or sad or happy. For example, for me, when I see the prompt of PR changes requested, I still notice a minor fight or flight response, a kind of clenching of my gut and kind of flushing of the face of, self-consciousness and nervousness. And being aware of that in the moment helps me recognize how I'm approaching the situation, and on a good day, try to take some steps to avoid an undesirable outcome, which leads me to the next emotional intelligence competency of self-management, which means it's also time for our next engineering metaphor. And so if you were to think of self-management in terms of software applications, you can think of it as how you respond to your monitoring and alerting. And if you notice that your application's memory is reaching critical levels, can you respond skillfully to prevent the app from crashing? And as amazing of a machine the body is, unlike our apps, we can't just program automation to have it automatically recover from an error. And so we constantly need to learn to respond to the feedback from our self-awareness. And I think respond is an important keyword to emphasize here, because this mantra to me basically sums up all the things I've heard and read about self-management and self-control, that it's all about learning to respond intentionally and mindfully rather than reacting instinctively. And as I've gotten better at noticing more subtle thoughts and feelings, like, again, that wave coming and just seeing it as it's starting to swell, I've literally bought myself more time to think about how I want to respond, instead of only recognizing after I've reacted that I would have rather done something else. For example, I've noticed, for instance, when I'm in a meeting and there's a topic that comes up that I'm really passionate about, and somebody's talking about something I disagree with, I might notice, flushing warmth in my face or my ears starting to tingle. And that just triggers to me that, okay, there's something that I'm really interested in here, really passionate about, but I don't want to get carried away. So let me take a couple of deep breaths and make sure I'm really listening to what this person has to say before I try to think about what I want to say in return. And deep breathing is really great for trying to kind of take a boiling kettle off the burner, but it's not going to solve every situation where you need to figure out how to respond. And so there's a couple other things I want to bring up. As I mentioned, we're often noticing these kinds of fight or flight responses when we get an email or a notification. And a lot of times they're not super urgent, being the current global situation, people aren't getting cornered in a office anymore and being forced to respond in the moment. So if you get a message or you get an email that you're noticing some response to, you don't have to write back immediately. You can take 5, you can take a walk, or even sleep on it sometimes if it's not urgent. Another concept I found really helpful in navigating my response is this concept of constructive anguish and useless rumination, which I learned about when watching a talk by Dan Harris that he gave at Google related to his book called 10% Happier, which I recommend. And the idea is, when you notice something, say nervousness, Is it constructive anguish or useless rumination? Are you nervous giving a talk that your audience isn't going to take you very seriously, or that you're going to misspeak and kind of lose your rhythm? Or is that nervousness something that you've already turned into constructive action and prepared, and at this point it's mostly just useless rumination? The other thing I like to keep in mind when thinking about how to respond is that everything changes, especially in technology, and that's both for the technology itself and the ways we work with it. The code we write is not set in stone, especially not the best practices that we often use as comparison with the code that we're working on leads to some of the judgmental thinking I was talking about earlier. And just to provide a concrete example, does anyone remember building SOAP APIs? I actually had to look up what that acronym meant. I think it's Simple Object Access Protocol. I'm sure most people in the audience today are familiar with REST APIs. They're pretty prevalent nowadays, but gRPC is quickly becoming a new standard, especially in the microservices domain, and in GraphQL being on the scene, it's kind of the state of the art in a lot of cases. But as Frederick Brooks famously wrote in his book, The Mythical Man Month, there's no silver bullet. None of these technologies are going to be state of the art forever. And so it's important to notice when you're catching yourself judging older technologies as like crufty or, you know, kind of out of date and obsolete. Well, obsolete is a technical thing, but yeah, assigning labels like crufty that have a negative connotation can be a bit of a slippery slope. And what I've been trying to do is to shift away from that judgmental mindset and towards one that acknowledges that people have been doing the best they could with what they've got, and instead try to focus on a mindset that values continuous improvement and evolution, because as I mentioned, everything's always changing. And last but certainly not least, when it comes to deciding how to skillfully respond and not instinctively react, make sure you're recharging your battery, getting enough food and rest. I've definitely noticed in hindsight that I was a little short-tempered in a meeting, and upon further reflection, realized that I had skipped lunch before the meeting. I'm just a really hungry person. I've realized I can't skip lunch, so I just try to make sure I cross that T and make sure I take care of that to make sure I can be fully present and respond in a productive way in these meetings. And another way self-management comes up for developers especially is a phenomenon that I'm calling distraction-driven development. And I've been guilty of this more times than I can count. Usually the story begins where I'm working on a task and it's already been discussed and estimated by the team. But as I'm writing the code, I notice something that distracts me. It's like a bug that I discover while I'm testing the feature I'm working on, or some part of the code that's maybe not factored as elegantly as I think it should be. In the past has led to me just like feeling like I need to fix this right now. It needs to be done the right way. And I created this huge pull request that's like thousands of lines long, and it's usually a frustrating experience for the people that need to review it because it's not all, you know, directly related to the original task that I was setting out to do. And so now I'm trying to do a better job of noticing when I get distracted and pausing and to decide how I want to respond. I'll try to consider how my actions affect the rest of the team and weigh the pros and cons of making the change in the moment versus creating a separate task to be discussed later with the team. Does that sound familiar to anyone, or anyone have any stories they want to share? In any case, it can be hard sometimes to know how to respond, even if you are able to use self-awareness to recognize that you're about to react and kind of think about what you want to do. And one of the things that I've found really helpful is the next emotional competency, motivation, because it helps me get in touch with my core values. For a software application, to stick with the theme, you can think of motivation as an application's service level objective. You have to know the system's constraints and the application's intended use case to set meaningful and challenging, but still reasonable goals. This could be anything from achieving performance benchmarks or even getting your code into space. And I also want to emphasize that this is specifically about intrinsic or internal motivation, your inner drive. And I think a study by Daniel Pink underscores this really well by saying that external motivators like money aren't the best way to encourage peak performance. And instead, he highlights these three aspects of internal motivation. Autonomy, or the urge to direct our own lives, because as it turns out, people don't really like being micromanaged. Mastery, or the desire to get better at something that matters. And I think for technologists, the something that matters qualifier is really important, because maybe learning to master that legacy COBOL mainframe application that's going to be obsolete in 6 months isn't going to make for the most fulfilling career. And purpose, or the yearning to do what we do in service of something larger than ourselves. When I think about this, I think about trying to have a positive impact on end users and the end users of the software that I build, the clients that I'm consulting with through Eighth Light, and the larger industry and community of software engineers that I'm a part of. And I've talked about self-awareness, and that can be a really good way for you to get to know yourself better and kind of work with your inner monologue to find what motivates you. But I've also found a couple of different writing prompts and journal prompts useful. Taking a couple minutes every day to jot down what you think of as your core values can be a really insightful way to understand what really matters to you and what motivates you. I mentioned before that I really wanted to be a good engineer and that I thought of that in very technical terms, but my self-worth was really tightly wound up in how good of an engineer I thought I was. And I think that's also why I struggled so much with imposter syndrome and self-doubt. But through journaling exercises like this, I'm able to step back and see a bigger, more holistic view of my persona, my identity, and my self-worth. And this makes it easier for me to let go of useless rumination on things at work and turn my attention towards, for example, to the affection that I feel for my partner and my dogs and my friends and family. And I can also be proud of accomplishments in my other areas of life, like beating my personal rock climbing record for the toughest rated climb that I've done. Another writing prompt I found useful is writing diary entries of your own, but in the future. And this was really helpful for me when I was trying to decide whether I wanted to continue my career as a software engineer that's specialized in iOS applications, or whether I wanted to branch out into something else like backend server development. And I decided to try to write a diary entry of myself in the future as an iOS engineer and how I had released an app to the App Store, and we had added support for watchOS and Catalyst and all these new frameworks that Apple was releasing. And we had 5 stars in the App Store and everything was going great. And I could maybe fill about a page. But then when I started writing about my future as a backend developer and how I built this massively scaled application that was running in data centers across the globe, and how we were hitting all of our service level objectives for latency, and that we had so many downstream clients that were depending on our API, and it enabled all this amazing functionality for the business, I was just writing multiple pages. I could tell that it was something that was really appealing to me and that I was really motivated to pursue that, and that made it a lot easier to make that decision. But as helpful as these journal entries are, like other things, what motivates me changes and will continue to change over time, and I'll have to come back and revisit them. And as much as motivation and self-awareness and self-management are a lifelong journey to master, I can't master emotional intelligence by focusing only on my self-awareness and managing myself and what motivates me. I have to turn my attention to others and cultivate social awareness as well. And that means it's time for another engineering analogy. And when I think of software that's socially aware, one application that comes to mind is a load balancer. For those of you who don't know, also called a proxy server, what a load balancer does is it accepts traffic from the internet, for example, and then forwards that traffic to multiple servers that are connected to it. What makes a load balancer socially aware is that it will measure different aspects of the traffic that it receives in response from the servers it's connected to. And if it notices, for example, that one of those servers is a little slower than usual, it will redirect traffic to the other servers that are healthy to give the slow server a chance to recover. And that kind of intuiting what another server in this case is kind of experiencing and that it's unhealthy is really a crucial component of social awareness. And for us mortals, it comes down to empathy. And that can be thought of in terms of understanding or even vicariously experiencing what someone else is thinking and feeling. This goes hand in hand with compassion or cultivating a genuine interest in others. And this is important. This is an important skill during normal times, but it's absolutely vital during a pandemic. Trying to think intentionally and consciously think about how other people that you're interacting with are feeling and what they might be going through outside of work gives you so much more information and has such an impact on how you might decide to interact with them and how you might interpret their actions. For example, I have coworkers that are taking on extra parental duties at home, splitting time, taking care of the kids, that they're living with people that are immunocompromised, and understanding everyone's unique experience and what they might be bringing into their interactions with you, and taking the time to consider that and think of others and have a genuine interest in their well-being is a crucial part of trying to understand how it is they're interacting with you, and then in turn, how you might respond. And another way you can do this, in addition to trying to actively, think about others and have a more compassionate mindset, is to focus not just on understanding what somebody is telling you in a conversation, but what that means about how they're feeling about what they're saying. And when I feel like I'm not entirely sure what somebody is saying, I'll try to revert to asking open-ended questions to try to get as close as I can to an unfiltered view of what they're trying to say or what they're feeling. And so if I'm talking to somebody and this comes up, I'll say, oh, can you say more about that? Or how did that make you feel? Instead of saying, oh, can you tell me why that's frustrating for you? Trying to steer the conversation, trying to just give them as much of an open-ended question as I can. And then the other thing that I'll try to do is after they've had a chance to elaborate more, I'll often restate back to them what it is that I heard. This is also kind of termed active listening. And so it sounds to me like that was really frustrating for you, or it sounds to me like you're really interested in working on that feature. And getting that confirmation from them really helps to make sure that you're not jumping to any conclusions about somebody's intent or what they're feeling. Something that also tends to get in the way for me, I think especially due to my engineering background, is jumping into problem solving when people come to me with a problem. I'm an engineer. I take a lot of pride in my ability to fix bugs and come up with solutions to problems. But a lot of times that's not really what people are looking for or even really need. And so when I notice myself doing that, I try to again revert into a listening mode and I just sometimes not even say anything and just give them a chance to talk and have somebody to listen, and maybe every once in a while chime in and validate their things by saying like, yeah, it sounds like that was really tough, or yeah, sounds like you worked really hard on that. Another mantra that I go back to a lot when I think of social awareness and empathy is this mantra that I came across in a book called Search Inside Yourself by Meng Tang. And I come back to this whenever I notice assumptions or biases in my own thoughts of others, or I'm thinking too much about what it is that I'm trying to do in the moment. And I try to think about the other people that I'm interacting with, that they've also been sad, disappointed, that everybody has struggles and suffers, and ultimately that everybody just wants to be loved and liked just like me. And as I've gained a deeper understanding and continue to work to make sure I remain open to understanding others' needs and wants, I've been able to try to use some of that knowledge to improve how I manage my relationships with others. And in software, relationship management often plays out across applications' APIs. Applications put a lot of trust in the APIs that they depend on, and the degree to which an application has good or bad relationship management skills can be thought of in terms of how well it maintains a stable API for its clients, or whether it's constantly introducing changes that break things and violate backwards compatibility and cause its clients all sorts of trouble. So for us, we don't have APIs, but we still need to learn how to positively influence and build trust in others. And a big part of that is balancing self-confidence and humility. People are drawn to confidence, but too much can drive them away. For me, trying to cultivate self-confidence was mostly a matter of learning to cope better with imposter syndrome and self-doubt and get out of my own way. But working on self-management and humility allows me to make space and return to compassion more often. And this helps me get aligned with what other people are trying to do and what they need and want, and also give them an opportunity to contribute to whatever it is we're doing, as opposed to just getting all wrapped up in whatever it is I'm trying to do and trying to prove my own worth by getting something done, thinking about checking my ego and getting other people involved and seeing how they think it should be done or what they wanted to contribute allows me to have a better relationship with them and collaborate more effectively. Something else that I've found super important when it comes to managing relationships is having difficult conversations and getting better at having difficult conversations. And there's a great book by Sheila Heen and others called Difficult Conversations, which says that there are 3 underlying existential questions to every difficult conversation. And that's, am I competent? Am I a good person? And am I worthy of love? And this is a typical undercurrent of a lot of conversations, and trying to reflect what people are saying off of these conversations can help tease out maybe some of the underlying feelings and address those feelings. Another aspect of difficult conversations that I found really insightful and powerful is that people won't listen unless they feel heard. And this, is the same slide from the section on empathy, making sure that you give people a chance to say what they want and how they feel and ask open-ended questions that give them the space to do that, and making sure that you're taking enough time to actively listen to what they're saying. Because once they feel heard, then maybe you'll have a chance to really feel heard yourself. Something else that's important with difficult conversations is avoiding accusatory language, because it not only will cause people to dig in their heels and become defensive, but it also assumes somebody has harmful intent. Instead, I try to speak honestly about the impact something had on me. For example, instead of saying, why'd you call me an idiot in front of the whole team and accusing somebody of doing that, I would say, when you critiqued my pull request like that in front of the team, it made me feel insecure and upset. And that allows them to then clarify what their intention might have been in that situation, and to have more of a learning conversation about what each person did to contribute to the dynamic and how to move forward and realign on how to work together and prevent hurt feelings in the future. Last but certainly not least, I want to come back to this slide. And this idea in difficult conversations is that disagreements are not about what's right and wrong, they're about what's important. And I think this is really vital for software engineers, because you can be totally correct in your assessment of the thread safety of a particular piece of code, or whether it's consuming a certain amount of memory. But until you're aligned about what's important, whether that's readability or delivering value to the business or proper documentation, the facts of the situation won't matter. It's more important to focus on what's important to any particular disagreement rather than who's right or wrong. To bring this back again to software engineering, I want to provide a couple examples of some difficult conversations you might encounter. The first one's pretty obvious in code review. I think there's a lot of underlying existential questions when you get into code review about people's competence. I've certainly felt a lot of self-doubt in code review, and I think it's important, both as the author and the reviewer, to remember that the other person is just like you. Postmortems can also be pretty fraught with tension. Like I mentioned, in avoiding accusatory language, it's really important to stay away from the blame game during postmortems and to instead focus the conversation on what happened and how it can be prevented moving forward. Planning meetings can also be pretty difficult in that it's often calling into question different people's or different teams' priorities. And just as I mentioned earlier, you need to align on what's important for all the people involved, rather than talking about whether it's right or wrong to work on a given ticket or the benefits that are going to be achieved through a given ticket. And so we've now covered all the different competencies in emotional intelligence, but I also want to highlight that they're not islands to themselves. They all have feedback loops between each other that reinforce the others, a lot of virtuous cycles going on. Self-awareness not just shapes our response to internal and external events through self-management, but it also helps us get to know ourselves and what motivates us, and provides a basis of understanding for what other people are experiencing that we can channel through empathy. And all of this, to me, culminates in what I strongly believe is the most valuable lesson I've learned in my whole career, which is to put people over programs. Code, features, projects, they all come and go. But what I've realized is most important to me is how well I get along with the people on my team, rather than the fact that the system we're writing was written the right way. And I hope that the next time you're distracted by a bug or reviewing somebody's code, you'll remember to use the emotional intelligence practices in this talk to shift your focus away from building the perfect app and towards building lasting relationships. And I'll leave up this slide for a bit, which contains some of the books that I drew inspiration from or cited directly in this talk. And I hope you'll check them all out. They were super impactful on me and my journey in my career, and I hope you'll find some inspiration here too. That's all I have to say. Thanks for coming.